I'm a former UK undercover police officer. Ask me anything. I have over 22 years law enforcement experience, including 16 years service with the police in London, during which time I operated undercover, in varying guises, between 2001 to 2011. I specialized in infiltrating criminal gangs, targeting drug and firearm supply, pedophilia, murder, and other major crime. Ever had someone say to you, "Are you a cop? Because you have to tell me if you are," and seriously think it works that way? Yep. I was dealing with a drug dealer who was such a nice bloke, and honestly, I would have gone for a beer with him under other circumstances. It was his day to be arrested, and he gave me my crack and heroin. I gave him my cash, and he said, "Chris, I really like you, man. I really get in with you. But, can you just tell me one thing?" "Sure," I said. "You're not an undercover policeman, are you? Because if you are, you legally have to tell me." "No, of course not, mate." Seconds later he had been pinned on the floor and handcuffed by the arrest team, and it made me feel quite sad. In fact, it's an urban myth obviously, as some previous subreddits have pointed out. Did you ever encounter any crooked cops or people in positions of power whilst you were undercover? If you did the higher-ups care about your findings on these people if it wasn't related to the case you were currently investigating? Crooked cops, a few, yes. And they get investigated with a thoroughness you wouldn't believe, even when it is nothing to do with the current case. What was the most difficult thing you had to do to maintain your cover? Whilst bored at the beginning of a long-term drugs operation, I decided to adopt a Forks Russian accent. The job lasted for many months, and I found it somewhat exhausting to keep that up. Some drug dealers also thought it was a piss take, and it led to several comical arguments in seedy council estate stairwells. Probably most difficult thing was pretending to be a pedophile and being enthusiastic and discussing some of the most abhorrent things humanly possible. Have you ever rolled on the ground and fired your gun in the air whilst screaming "Arag"? Often. What was your closest call? Edit. More specifically, when undercover, were you ever close to being exposed? When you're undercover, you experience extreme rights of paranoia, so this is difficult to quantify. I think maybe the occasion alluded to above was the closest. I had been going to a particular pub for months, getting my face known etc, in order to get into a local criminal gang, known to loathe outsiders and by uber suspicious. All was going well, but the senior officer in charge wanted some action, despite me saying this is a softly long-term job. So, they sent along a fellow undercover officer, who was a lovely guy, but loud, brash and gregarious, the exact opposite to me. Maybe I was being overly paranoid, but bearing in mind, I had had no trouble in this place for months. This fellow approached me one evening in the pub and said one of the gang had just accused him of being a police officer. I wanted to then leave, but thought better of it, choosing to brave it out. Well, the alcohol continued to flow, and I remember I had drunk so much I had to be sick outside. As I was merrily vomiting outside, some of the gang began leaving the pub and addressing me as officer and Sarge. In my criminal guise, I decided to take umbrage at this and began a full-on argument with them and was joined by my colleague. This scenario narrowly missed descending into ultra-violence when the landlord grabbed us both and locked us in the now empty pub and barricaded the doors. Stuff was being thrown at the pub and shouting and hollering etc, which after about 10 minutes, died down. Thankfully, we were lucky not to get a kicking, to be honest. What is your most interesting or disturbing case? Disturbing for me, probably anything dealing with pedophilia. One's case involved making a call to a suspected child abuser who had been identified online. The idea was that I would give him a quick call for no other reason than to arrange potentially some sort of meeting in the future. I expected to be on the phone with him for 5 minutes, and for him to be ultra suspicious, and actually for the call not to yield anything other than a possible agreement to call again later. I was totally taken aback when the call ended up lasting around 45 minutes, with this guy describing, in rather sickening detail, the activities he wanted to engage in with my fictional children. In fact, I had to end the call myself, as I felt physically ill engaging in such conversation, although I expected that I should do so as part of my job. It was a conversation which I find disturbing to this day, made all the more potent by the fact that I had to display enthusiasm and engage in the chat with a certain amount of vigor to maintain my cover. I had several more conversations of that ilk with the guy and eventually met him in person. I was very nervous when meeting him, not because of a fear of impending violence or anything like that, but just because the urban cop myth states that a pedophile can always recognize another pedophile, and I was anxious that he would simply dismiss me in person for that reason. Evidently, this didn't happen, and the meeting passed without a hitch and the guy was arrested and taken to court. All in all, a really quite disturbing episode which haunts me every now and then. How does being undercover affect your personal life, as you won't be able to describe to them what you do, and when you do it? I cannot think how strong you have to be to deal a dual life, just for the betterment of society, and not your personal life. Honestly, a bit trite, but it fucks you up. Not just not being able to tell them about stuff, but just the concept that you are striving to put away bad people, and it means that you inevitably sacrifice part of your life, at the time just temporarily, but as it turns out, it affects you forever. And yes, you have to be strong in many respects, even turning your nose up at moral questions. I wasn't strong enough, hence my departure from the police. Where do you draw the line? What's something you won't do to keep your cover intact? What are you willing to do? There are hard and fast rules in the UK about what you can and can't do. It would depend on the circumstances, but suffice to say, you learn and are trained to wheedle your way out of situations using some swift banter and chat. You can't commit crime essentially, although there are certain circumstances where you can. I wouldn't do anything which harmed anyone else to keep my cover. I would expect not to be in such a situation anyway. If I do my job right, then I shouldn't expect to have made such a disastrous choice of action, where someone is asking me to do something awful. On a personal level, I would do anything to save my own life, or that of someone I loved. So if it came down to, theoretically, someone saying admit you're a cop or I kill your kids, then it's a no-brainer. There were many occasions where people would suspect you were a cop, and you just put on some bravado and get on with it. Although one such occasion I ended up barricaded in a pub surrounded by angry gentlemen who were in no doubt I was a cop. That operation ended there and then. What's your most satisfying arrest or good result on something you were working on? Also, what areas of London were the main spots for organized criminal activity? Satisfying arrest was Juan Carlos Guzman Betancourt. Not an undercover job, just when I was a detective, known as the world's top conman. Best result operating undercover was any job where I bought a gun or snared a child abuser. London has no main hotspots for crime. There are traditional bad areas. Beacon and Stratford for Lithuanian criminality, Islington and some part of southeast London for old school London baddies, Tottenham, Hackney for baddest youth and Turkish gangs etc. But also places like Chelsea, Kensington etc. house some of the biggest baddies of all. Bankers, fixers, oligarchs etc. Being right there on the streets, I am curious as to what your opinion is towards the war on drugs. Do you think legalizing most drugs will bring serious crime figures down? The war on drugs is a waste of time, effort, and resources. I spent many years dealing with drug dealers who, in the main, are poor people, driven by poverty or environment, to commit crime. One of the reasons I left the police was the constant criminalizing of the poor. I don't know whether legalizing drugs per se will bring crime figures down, but what I do know is that prohibition does not work. There are still people making a lot of cash out of people's misery, and people die so that lines of coke can be snorted across the land. The old adage that when you arrest a street dealer, another one replaces him in a second is so very true. The wire is real, people. There is a great organization called LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, which counters some great arguments for and against. How did you get involved in undercover work? Were you specifically selected, or were they asking for volunteers? And how are you trained for UC work? Excellent IAmA. Voluntary, and you go through a rigorous selection process, like several interviews, psychometric testing, and a selection course, where you get about 3 hours sleep a night. The training is classified, and I would get my balls sliced off if I divulged any of it that's not already in my book. When undercover, did you ever partake in substances? Kind of a do a line with me to prove you're legit kind of thing. Also, while undercover, did you live at home and keep a regular life during the times? What would you say if things like occupation, hobbies, usual small talk bullshit would come up? If I met you in a pub while undercover, would your behavior and mannerisms be the same as if I met you in a pub today? Or did you have to make personality changes while working? And if so, have any of those changes stuck with you today? If I didn't know you, then I may affect some mannerisms I might not usually have, just whilst I scoped you out. My actions and demeanor whilst undercover is not anything like the real me, I have to say. Close saint I get is sometimes when I get angry about something, I have this weird switch which flicks into Cockney gangster mode, but it only lasts for a second, and I realize I'm acting like a buffoon. I never did any gear whilst undercover, and had plenty of reasons not to, none of which were ever questioned by the badders. Yes, I would live at home, my real home, when doing undercover work, but cops generally keep close counsel, and that means often associating only with other cops, so it was easy to be in social scenarios. You ever have to fight someone to be initiated? How does an outsider get inside a gang? No, I haven't, thankfully, and such activities at the higher echelons of organized crime are fairly rare. I spent some time attempting to wheedle into various non-UK criminal fraternities, and the simple fact of the matter is, if they have the slightest doubt about you, they will keep you at arm's length. I never heard of, or was involved in, the concept of fighting to be initiated into a gang. It's slightly more difficult and sophisticated than Hollywood would have you imagine, and a lot more dull and prolonged. I think the concept of blooding in the UK would be really limited to lower level criminals, football hooligans and youth/street gangs, as opposed to the higher level organized firearms and drug gangs who wouldn't want unnecessary law enforcement attention from such activity. That's not to say there wasn't an element of violence in these organizations, but it was very few and far between. Probably the threat element was a bigger issue, that is the threat of violence and the reputation of such organizations. Dependent upon the gang, it is almost impossible to infiltrate a long-standing criminal organization. They are generally very switched on, and whilst you may get accepted on the periphery, to actually become an insider is ridiculously difficult. This is why such infiltrations, Joe Piston being the most famous one, are celebrated and talked about to this day. In the UK there are strict laws and regulations about the activities which undercover officers can engage in, so being part of a gang and being asked, for example, to take part in a violent act or commit a serious crime, that's not gonna happen. Thanks for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content. I'm just starting this channel out, so all the help I can get would be great. Thanks.